Hi, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason. And we're here with our friend, Quincy Rush.
Hey.
And you're listening to the 𝐰𝐢𝐬𝐧𝐬 and Perplexed podcast.
So we had mentioned Quincy is here, and I'm going to let Quincy just introduce himself. What would you want the listeners to know about you?
Well, I'm Quincy Rush. The scripted version of how I introduce myself is that I was born in Lubbock, Texas, grew up in Guadalajara, Mexico, moved back and forth between the States and Mexico, and then became an AIM student, and became an AIM student, went to Lubbock, Texas for a year, went back to Mexico, and worked as an intern for a missionary in Mexico City. And I'm back in the States working with the AIM program, which is a missionary intern training school in Texas. I've known Connor and Bryant for... Nope, I've known Connor and Jason.
I looked at you, Jason, to see if you were going to say anything.
I lose my identity when you're around. That's
would it help if you just we ended there and then asked you questions? Would it help?
I'm okay with you keeping that in if you want.
Okay, we'll say whatever. We'll see. Let's see how funny.
Whatever you want with that.
So you're working with AIM right now, and is that like a calling that you feel towards missions, or like what's the driving force behind what you're up to?
I don't know. I grew up on a mission field. Like my parents were both missionaries, and I am interested in doing full-time ministry or missions. I just don't know what doors will open or not. And right now it's, I'm involved in equipping young people to step into ministry and step into mission work, even though I don't feel too accomplished in mission work myself, which feels weird.
So you were mentioning, you were talking to me earlier. This was a few days ago, but I said it like it was a couple minutes ago. You were talking to me earlier how it's like once a month you're getting to preach in Spanish to a congregation in Lubbock. Yeah,
it's a little town 2 hours northwest of Lubbock, and they have a Spanish ministry, and they needed a preacher. They have a preacher that comes once a month and another that's going on to other things, and so they needed another person who speaks Spanish and can organize sermons. And so now I'm AIM assisting. I'm preaching once a month-ish in Spanish, and I've only done that once so far. I'm doing it again this Sunday.
Nice.
And I'm doing remodeling, like carpentry.
Man, there is a quintessential. I didn't realize how close I came to actually saying Quincy Central. Quintessential. Like it sounds obviously I want to say like your story right now is massive right now, and it's not the beginning. It's you're smack dab in the middle of it, and it sounds really cool. But it also just sounds like quintessential. Like yes, I'm doing carpentry. I'm preaching preaching Spanish once, and then that's the story you're telling. Way down the road, and someone goes like, "Man, that's really cool." Like especially that you chose carpentry. It's just like the perfect fit for it.
How Jesus of you. I am curious how you would respond to. So we're looking at the dynamic we were discussing a little bit earlier about Jesus, and there's this teaching piece that we assume they're his disciples, which translates learners. So he's teaching them, and then you find yourself in a space where you're teaching, and in one way, you're obviously not the man, Jesus Christ, but there's a clear scriptural basis of thinking, okay, I am working with Jesus in training the proverbial next generation, even if these guys are only 3, 4, 5 years younger than me. So how do you carry that? You had said, though I'm not accomplished, but how does that feel to recognize I'm in this space and I'm one of the representatives of Jesus to this next group? How do you carry that, I guess?
I guess it's kind of scary because I came into AIM assisting, which is like being on staff with AIM, having been a AIM student during COVID, meaning we didn't get to do a lot of the stuff that these AIMers get to do, meaning I don't have the experience they're getting. So I'm going through it, learning kind of what they're learning some of the time, and I've gotten to get that experience on the field, but not while I was in Lubbock, not while I was in the school portion of it, and I'm really glad that I'm not the oldest one in the room when it's that kind of stuff, or the most experienced one in the room, because I have a lot of people that I can practice leadership, and I can practice almost, I guess, mentorship, but there doesn't feel like there's a lot of pressure on me since I'm not the experienced person in the room. There's a lot of people that have more, and I lean on them quite a bit. And so I feel a bit of freedom in that I can lean into leadership, and then I can also lean on more experienced leaders at the same time. And that the aimers that I'm working with know I'm doing that, and they're like, I can be open about it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it creates this space that what creates insecurity in us a lot is that feeling that we have to posture.
Yeah.
And you're saying you don't have to pretend, much. And that's nice because leadership often doesn't allow that.
Yeah.
You got to fake it till you make it kind of thing, which there's something you can fake it till you make it. But if you can't tell people the truth about that, then it feels like now, in addition to everything I'm doing, I got to expend energy in hiding.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's good.
Yeah. And it's one of those cool things. Like, I mean, how long have you known Quincy, Jason?
I remember hearing about Quincy before Quincy knew Quincy. But yeah, I knew Quincy when he was born.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to say how old you are, Jason, because
I'm ancient.
I've forgotten, honestly. There's something about when people cross like 50 that it just like it all becomes 50 to 60. It's all like the same age.
50. It was a beautiful era.
It's a beautiful time. But so Jason's an unambiguous age.
Older than 50.
Older than 50.
At least.
I'm the opposite of women. I want you to think I'm much older than I am.
Very distinguished. And so I'm approaching 30. And when I was interning at a church, Quincy was in the youth group that I was interning for. And
actually, I was still in Tulsa when you were fired.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I mean, if you want to go.
Let's start right there.
Okay.
And
First,
on Sunday, I'm preaching about that, and also preaching about I have a friend who was fired for saying this, so let's have fun and talk about this.
Oh, man.
So,
Okay. Well, I wish I wasn't busy. Get down to Lubbock this weekend. And
I'll
see what
blame
it
you
is.
if I'm fired for the job I've had for a month.
Well, honestly, it would be the turn would be like, and he's a dummy and an idiot, which is why you shouldn't be like him. But wow, that's so cool to hear. And Quincy was not in the youth group that I got fired from.
Yeah,
he was in the youth group at Memorial where I cut my teeth, so to speak. But I just think it's one of those cool things, and it's one of those examples you're talking about, like with leaning into leadership and also leaning on leadership. Where Jason has been this example for me of like, there's so many people throughout church history and people that we know that's a 50-year-old person that's been in ministry for 30 years or however long, would just be super easy to be like, I knew you when you were born. I knew you, Connor, when you said some of the dumbest things that have ever been said in front of people. I have a specific thought in mind, but it would be super easy to be so dismissive. And I think this gets to the heart, like what you're talking about, Quincy, gets to the heart of Amazed and Perplexed, whereas like there is, like honestly, like obviously Jason and I are so personally enriched by like our relationship, and I've learned so much from him. But not to sound like full of myself, there is so much enrichment that if the attitude of like, well, I'm the leader here, and this is a one-way street of enrichment that Jason would have missed out on, and I think so much of the people we read in Scripture miss out on with their interactions, with how they navigate how they're living out their faith.
Yeah, I think so. And this is the part, and this goes down to how, at least I perceive that whole word disciple, is that I don't disciple anyone. I can participate in the discipling because Jesus is the one doing the discipling, and I may have more experience in an area and maybe more advanced, or maybe just that's a phase of giftedness, whatever it is we're talking about, but God's doing something totally different in the other person.
Yeah, and while I'm maybe involved in their growth, they're involved in mine, and we're both studying Jesus together, it seems like.
That's right. Yeah. And there's something also about, how there's compound interest, which if you saw my bank account, you'd be like, oh, I guess you don't know about it, Jason. But that idea of investing.
One day you'll start saving.
One day you'll start saving once I get to my, what's the next era? But that idea of being, there's something about me investing today and then watching God work. And then I've had these moments over and over again. Are like, oh man, that is so beautiful. I had that. I got to participate in that, and now I'm participating in this, and now I'm participating in this. So it's even like extrapolating to what happens when Indigo takes the mic, Connor's daughter or your future children, and we're just watching that God's work through the generations. That's just super exciting because I met your dad, over 30 years ago, and it's fascinating watching our journeys, together. And now I have a separate journey with you and your siblings, I don't know. It's just the fact that God sees all that simultaneously is both mind-blowing and super exciting.
Yeah. And I think that gets to the heart of what we're talking about today, and we'll set up here in a little bit, but just the dynamic of thinking about when we think about the next generation, or we think about, teaching people or people learning from us. So often we're trying to fit people into these old wineskins, these old models of doing things. The assumption that this is how it's gonna work. And I think a lot of why people ran away from church and rebelled was because they were put into an old wineskin and it burst. And they were told that they were the problem. They were told that the issue that they had wasn't the old wineskin. It was actually them. And so I want Jason to set it up a little bit more here, and just give some dignity to this passage.
We are in Luke chapter 5. And we're continuing looking over Jesus' shoulder, trying to give dignity to everyone involved in the context. I just wanted to speak a little bit to what's happening here around the context. Now, if you recall, Jesus has just delivered his words to his disciples who are asking on behalf of the Pharisees, hey, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And I assume it's his disciples, yes, that then pose the question. So this is interesting. It fascinates me how infrequently the disciples are presented as questioning Jesus. You would think they just have a bazillion and one questions, and it's not that they never question. Where we usually remember is where they make assertions that are wrong. But they don't ask that many questions, and we've talked about this for a while, just that dynamic of how close were Jesus and his disciples. But in this particular case, I think it's fascinating that he's delivering this primarily to the disciples. Now, there may be a crowd on the edge, but we're not told that. And so he is in a space, these are still the early years of him interacting with the disciples. And so I always wonder about the insecurities, the expectations, the fears. Is there any, if you think of your Enneagram types or your, Myers-Briggs designations, are you more anxious types? Are you more analytical types? Are you more impetuous types? Are they like, how are they hearing this? And my expectation, honestly, is they're like, yes, yes. And their face, it's like how I listen to my wife sometimes. Yes, 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 yes. And at the end, they're like, do you know what she said? I don't know. I mean, I got words, but I don't know what it means. I just think this really speaks to that whole dynamic of what would it be like to stand right next to Jesus. And I think this is one of the other things where they're like, okay. And it ends in that similar way where when you have this chapter break, it doesn't pick up and here was the response. It just moves on. And so I think it's fascinating. So you have on one level, you would have a sense there'd be more intimacy, just him and his apostles. But on the other level, I don't think they're getting this. I don't think they're tracking it.
Well, I think if I were to try to make it feel as real as possible, I think the feeling that the disciples are going to get here, seeing this move away from fasting. I mean, the fasting was a way of life for them. It was a ritual. Every single week, it was a part of their daily rhythm, daily way of living. And so if I were to think about how this would feel for me, I would imagine, okay, you have your Catholics and you have your Protestants. And there's so many differences we could come up with between, a Catholic and a Protestant, the church, individual, everything. But even so, even in communion, right? There's going to be different ways that a Catholic practices communion and any number of Protestants practice communion. But there's an agreement hey, we should do this, and it's going to look different maybe, but we should do this. It's an important part of things. And Jesus' disciples are coming, and they're not Jesus is not saying never fast, don't do it. But suddenly this thing that these people that would have had these vehement disagreements on could come together and be yeah, this is a thing we all kind of feel pretty strongly on. All of a sudden, you're being one of the few things that the enemies are getting along with. You don't care about. It's not something that's central to what you're doing. That would come off as kind of, that would just, it's hard to fathom because there's so few connecting points between John's disciples and the Pharisees, that for this connecting point, for this thing that they could draw on and be yeah, there is some similarity between us. For Jesus to be that is not super important to me, would be so jarring to his people.
Well, and I totally misrepresented this. I'm just now realizing these are the Pharisees posing the question. Mm-hmm. And so scratch everything I said about the intimacy piece, but the emotional effect of the apostles hearing about this, that I wonder, were they thinking, yeah, I'd wondered why we hadn't done that. So they're not even asking the question, which just further magnifies, are they like, oh yeah, this is exactly what we thought, but they're not asked. It's like if I was talking to Quincy here and I was like, hey Quincy, here's some things you need to know about Connor. It's like, I'm right here. I can answer that question because it's about his disciples, Mm-hmm. So it's, in some ways it's even more, I don't know if you say disrespectful, but it's like disconnected.
Okay, and right before then, in the previous section, they're asking questions about Jesus with Jesus in the room. Like why do you eat and drink with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belong to their sect complained to his disciples, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus answered. And so they're not even talking to Jesus. And then they turn to Jesus and ask him a question about his disciples. And they're never asking the right person
That's question. Fascinating. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Well, and I think that gets to like what the relationship would have been like, how the normal person that is like interested in hearing Jesus would hear these people. It's like, okay, you have these vague authority figures, the Pharisees, right? But then you got this new cool guy on the scene, John, and he's got all these really cool ideas, and a lot of people believe him. And then suddenly there's this third party that you have to contend with, and you wouldn't blame somebody at the time being like, okay, like, what's something we all can agree on? We can all agree on, fasting. That's a good Jewish practice. It's in the Torah. And she's like, meh, yeah, like your heart is not really, you don't really have that right heart about it, but whatever. And you could just be kind of like, just this whiplash of going back and forth. And you would totally, and I would totally honor the person hearing these three perspectives going like, what am I supposed to do here? What am I supposed to believe here? This is so, these people that have a lot of trust, and sound right, sound like they know what they're talking about. There's a lot of there's so much conflict here. What am I supposed to do as your regular, ordinary guy hearing this?
Yeah, which also raises the question, I was taught you're listening for doctrine. So if you were talking to me right now, even back to the, the discussion about what the Protestants approach communion this way, Catholics approach it this way, and all these differences, I was raised to listen to your words, and all I'm asking myself is what's right, what's wrong. I didn't know I was doing that. That's what I was doing. And I think a lot of Christians think that way. And I think it's fascinating here. If you're tracking Jesus and you're like, okay, fasting. So right now I'm fasting, or like, should we do it? Should we not? And he answers, he doesn't correct them. So you assume they're not fasting. And he uses the illusion of the bridegroom, but it's not like he gives a definitive answer. And then he goes into this stuff about the wineskin. And it's like, can you just answer me yes or no? I mean, this constant state of ambiguity that he keeps them in, and I'm not suggesting it's not possible to understand. I'm simply suggesting I don't think they understood.
That's good.
When he could have just said yes, no.
Yeah, that's really good. And I'm not honoring so much of the division and the split of churches in the past, but it brings to mind like how many times. And I wonder even if Jesus is drawing on this a little bit, like how many times like a non-Christian will look at the differences between a different denomination or church or whatever and be like, you guys believe almost the exact same thing. It's whatever, like what, like you're splitting the hairs you're splitting are so thin. And I wonder if there's a sense here in which Jesus is confronting this old wineskin of wanting the clear distinction, of wanting God, following God to be this easy thing of when do I fast, when do I not fast, when is it appropriate, when is it not, give me the black and white definitive rules. And I wonder if part of what Jesus is speaking to in this wineskin dynamic is, listen, your categories for what it is to be a follower in the kingdom of God, you have to reorient them. You need new wineskin for it.
So now, hey, Quincy, would you mind reading? So back to, again, Luke 5, beginning in verse 33.
Yeah, I'll be reading verse 33 through 39 and in NIV.
It doesn't matter.
That's what my Bible app was on when I opened it, so that's what I'll be reading verse 33 through 39 in NIV, and it says, they said to him, John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. but yours go on eating and drinking." Jesus answered, "Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. In those days they will fast." He told them this parable, No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. Otherwise they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the new wine will burst the skins. The wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, wants the new, for they say the old is better.
So as we do, Jason, is there something about this passage that is amazing you right now?
This builds on what we were saying earlier, but to get very specific with this passage, that dynamic of taking something simple, I like when you say wineskin, I don't know what that is from normal everyday use, but he's taken this, and I think it's one of the most profound illustrations and one of the sharpest descriptions of where we go wrong in following God. And it's one of those, parabolic dynamics that where you're like, okay, I didn't know what it meant for the longest time. It just was like, what are we even talking about here? It wasn't until the last probably 10 years that I felt like, okay, I see what he's saying, at least to the degree that I can understand. And so the notion that, he's saying, look, there's this, I think in terms of construct, and the construct is, it's a collection of ideas that form together to explain something. And so he's saying this construct of wineskins is a wineskin is created to obviously hold wine. And so when it gets too old, you stop putting new wine in because of the nature of the wine needs to breathe and this kind of thing. But it's like anything. I mean, when something gets worn, you typically get rid of it and you put new in new. And so what he's saying here is, and you got to keep in mind, it's in response to something. This isn't abstract. This isn't a void. He's saying in response to the Pharisees, and I think this goes back to something that was said earlier, but it's that dynamic of it isn't about fasting. It's about assumptions. It's about thinking you've got it figured out. And the thing is, I believe that everything I believe is a wineskin, and there are correlating thoughts, like what I believe about how to make a bologna sandwich. It obviously is not near as pressing as other convictions, and so it doesn't correlate with how I think a person is saved, for example. But there is these ideas in orbit that kind of come together, and maybe I've done a lot of thinking, so it's really articulated and clear, or maybe I haven't done any thinking, so it's kind of vague. But that's your construct, and everybody listening to this has a construct. And so what we're talking about here is the construct, this collection of ideas of what it means to truly connect with God, because why they would use fasting, it was to clear space to connect with God. So what they're saying is, why did these people and ours, which is ironic, they're choosing to side with John, look, John and us are doing the same, like, you hate John, it's so disingenuous, but it's like, we're doing this, why aren't you? And what they're saying is our construct says, our wineskin says that you need to do this or you're not close to God. So we're making the assumption, well, you're not close to God if you're not doing what we are doing to get close to God. And Jesus says, look, number one, you don't understand the times, the bridegroom dynamic, we're in this special era, because he's not saying we should never fast. He's simply saying we're on a different phase, which that right there is fascinating to me now that I say it out loud, is what phase are you in your life now that demands different things of you that God doesn't demand of other people in different phases, or you the next phase. But that whole idea of him saying, I need to make this so plain, and of course, if you were raised with wineskins, it'd probably be clearer. But this idea of you have these ideas in your mind, and now God's trying to teach you something new, and it's just blowing it up. And you're going to have to adopt a whole new way of thinking about it, not just the specific symptoms of the idea, but the idea itself of how do I please God? Because what I'm introducing you is not simply adding a few more clarifications on doctrine. It's a whole different thing. And that I feel like is kind of our problem now, is that struggle. I have all these assumptions. Well, God must work this way. And when I'm given another way, I say, well, then that must not be of God.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that sticks out is so incredible. And just building off what you said, Jason, it is truly amazing to me. There is such an easy pull, I think, for us where we live now, to be angry at people who hold on to old wineskins, who want to fit everything back into the old wineskins, or patch the old garment with all the new stuff, and want to just try to hold on as strong as they can. What's so incredible to me is Jesus is not like saying the old wineskin was bad. Like, get rid of that was a trash thing. And say, listen, the fact that you have held on to this wineskin for too long has caused that one to burst, has caused that one to fail, has caused that one to be useless, and now it's disformed far from what it was meant to be, and far from what it ever was. And so there's this element here where Jesus is not just like, we can really easily, people have read Jesus as like Jesus saying, never fast, never do anything like this, run away from the Jewish scriptures as fast as you can. But there's so much honoring here of like, listen, what you're doing is it's not just bad to what the new thing I want to do. It's also making the old thing that you were worshiping ugly, and goes against what it was always intended to be.
I think that is really good. And I've struggled with that. When you're changing something in your church, there's a tendency to say, oh, so who's the bad guy? Or the bad thought, the bad doctrine, whatever you want to say there. And it's like, no, we're talking about how does God's love show up right now for this generation? We learn from everything that came before. And you don't have to make something the bad guy or the bad doctrine in order to adopt something new. And it happens all through the Bible. We just maybe didn't allow ourselves to see it.
My dad was reading a book called *𝐶𝐮𝐤𝐡 the Mountains, and it's about, maybe, I bet he's told you about it, but that during the Lewis and Clark expedition, they thought that the river they were taking west they could like cross the mountains, and almost the same river would be on the other side. That water would be flowing both sides from the mountains. So they took their canoes, and when they got to the spot they would have to walk, they carried the canoes with them, and at some point along the way had to decide, because the further they went, the more the temptation felt like the river will be right on the other side of this mountain. And so they kept having to carry these canoes with them, and the sooner they would put down the canoe, the faster they would be able to move, but they didn't know that there was no river on the other side, so they kept carrying their canoe. And that the book was talking about what are practices in the church that we carry not because the Bible tells us to, but because this is our tradition, and which ones, I don't think it specified which ones we should leave, but like just the thought that we have traditions that aren't, that are tradition, that are, they're not doctrine. So what do we do with them when we run into a mountain like that? Because we know stuff like that might come about. We just don't know what's on the other side of it. And there's sometimes we have to leave stuff, and sometimes it is useful to carry it with us.
Yeah, I love that picture, especially like just what are the things, whether it be doctrine in the church or just our own lives and following God. What are the things that are so cumbersome, that are breaking our back, that we are just dragging behind us as we try to follow God, as we try to reach Him. And that picture, I've not a canoe, because I can't canoe, but I've been in a situation where I have been carrying very heavy objects over far distances, and it just slowly breaks you down and slowly degrades you, and you slowly become more and more hunched. And I love that picture, especially when you think about what it was like to be an Israelite at this phase, is 400 years without hearing from God, constantly oppressed, constantly being taken over by new empire after new empire, and the old cumbersome canoe is not giving the same life, right? Where the canoe before, it caused them to be able to navigate a river, get where they need to be as quicker than any other mode of transportation. And suddenly this beautiful thing, this amazing invention, is becoming this noose around your neck.
Mm-hmm.
That is, I'll tell you too, this is a fascinating thought to me. And it's different. We're in a different era where we as individuals have access to the Holy Spirit. But it's like, this country hasn't existed 400 years, and then we say it so casually, 400 years of silence. It's like, oh, that's way longer than this country has been around. And it's like, can you envision that maybe our kids, our grandkids would experience an era with God showing up in a different way, a more powerful way, not even more powerful, but just unique, And the key here isn't that I'm not a prophet, I'm not predicting. The key here is, am I teachable? Am I willing to learn? Because the human tendency is we're given, here are your thoughts, here are your ideas, in church parlance, your doctrines, here they are, and keep those for life. And the main thing to do is just hold on to those. And this is Jesus saying and it's a parable, but I think it's pretty specific. He's saying, look, you've got to be willing to accept that you don't know everything, number one. Number two, that God has something new to share for you. And the work that you're going to have to do around it is letting go of the old. Now it's important to note, he's not telling them to let go of all the old. You know, he's simply saying, be teachable and let God show you what you need to give up or refine. Because Jesus said, I've come to fulfill everything, not to get rid of it. So it's like, okay, what is God needing to fulfill in my understanding that right now I'm like, well, that can't be true. And then it's like, oh, okay, I see what you're saying there.
Yeah. Well, and even with that, with this example that Jesus gives of the new wineskin, it is a new thing, but it's not. It's what the old was made to be, right? It's what it was supposed to be. It's the fulfillment. It's the goodness of that. And so there's a tendency in my heart, because I'm some young rebel or whatever, to be like, throw it all out, right? Throw it all out. But maybe in some circumstances that's what should be done. But I also think Jesus is still honoring what their expectation is and saying, like, yes, I think there is an honoring here that Jesus does of their expectation and of going, listen, the heart of what we're talking about here, the heart of fasting, the heart of these issues that you're worried about, that you're getting hung up on. I have come to fulfill the heart of those things. I've come to bring those things about the way they were always meant to be. And again, getting that meta piece that you talked about.
The piece that amazes me is a little further up in the piece we read, that Jesus asks, can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? And that he's framing this segment in joy, or that his time on earth with his disciples in joy, that he's saying, like, right now we're not fasting because this is our time of celebration together. And then he also points out, like, and there will be a time of grief and possibly a time of just normal life, and that that right now the canoe they're carrying isn't one that would look like what they're carrying when he's not with them, but that when he's there, everything's framed in joy.
Yeah, I love that. And that's the interesting piece here. And even obviously we know, if he's saying this is a time of joy, which I think you're reading that correctly, then it's like, that's pretty hard. Yeah. And from the apostles, I don't know if they would consider this time easier. My assumption is they would consider this time like there was a clear demarcation between before knowing Jesus and after knowing Jesus.
Oh yeah, that time that we're looking forward to not having homes, wandering around, everyone hates us, and then it all ends in the culmination of the biggest defeat of our lives, where the guy we were following is dead.
And the thing that we had hoped for, the thing that we thought all this was leading to, was proven to be false. So everything we thought he was going to be this conqueror, this warrior Messiah, and that's wrong. And so even the joy that they get in the presence of Jesus is coming from a part of the joy they're getting has to be from their expectation of how he's going to fulfill Jewish prophecy, and that's wrong. And Jesus is still being like, but have joy, even in your wrongness, even in your not getting it, even in your homelessness, even in your hunger. I still want you to enjoy me, even if you don't have the 100% correct perspective on me. And how often do we rob people of the joy of Jesus because they don't have the full picture of who we think he is?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting too. He's basically saying, again, if you dig into the dynamics of fasting, why not fast? Because fasting is to create space for God. But he's saying God's here. So this is a backhanded way also of just asserting his identity, which of course is the problem they're having. If the Pharisees honored him as God, they probably wouldn't have this question. They would be like, how do we get more of you? How do we fast, using that term more broadly, how do we fast from what we'd usually do to take you in? And to hear from you and to watch you. Yeah. So I'm wondering what hits you that's confusing or troubling, or you're going to have to ponder it more.
I'm going to be honest, I'm always confused by the old new wineskin thing, and what you said used to confuse you is what, and I don't know if that fits in with perplexion, but I mean, similar word, that this has cleared that up for me a little, just knowing a fuller perspective on what Jesus is really talking about, because this always went over my head.
I mean, that makes sense. Yeah, and part of the reason I do want to say we didn't say Quincy's going to be on. Let's pick a more confusing one, because if we're doing that, we go to Matthew 23 and then make you explain it to us. But it is that, or is that Luke 23? I'll work on that later. It's so troubling. I blotted it from my memory.
Their thoughts were, we're going to have a really smart guy come on today, so let's get one that used to confuse me really badly, see what wise things he has to say, and
That's
then
right.
I just disappointed you
last
utterly.
The podcast is me showing you pictures of a tsunami and be like, explain this, Quincy.
It's just happened.
So I've been
yesterday.
listening to The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis recently, and
I would just like you to figure this out for me.
Yes,
no,
please go ahead.
Oh, so what perplexes me? So it's the perception that the Pharisees have of the disciples is so fascinating. They talk about John's disciples fasting and praying, and the disciples of the Pharisees do too. And yours go on eating and drinking, and then Jesus goes on to compare the bridegroom. And I'm just so fascinated because you don't get this picture. And again, it's a completely different culture, so it's degrees, right? But you don't get this picture. I mean, maybe you kind of do a little bit. I don't know, of a picture of the disciples as these guys who are living in the moment, are joyful because God is in their midst or whatever. But in comparison, how the outside is viewing them is like you got these bunch of like rowdy whatever, these people that just are not sanctimonious. They're not so focused on sacrament or however you'd phrase it. And so it's just interesting to see the outside perspective of the disciples, because you see a lot more of the outside perspective of Jesus from like the Pharisees or from other people, but it's utterly fascinating to see the outside perspective of the disciples. And I go like, okay, how do I need to reorient if the outside is viewing the disciples as this kind of person? Do I need to reorient how I use a big word, exegete, like the passages where the disciples are found? Because there are plenty of things where the disciples are obtuse, or they don't get things, or they're frustrating or whatever, but like you would get the picture of them as this you get this picture of them if you focus on the passages that I do focus on, that they're these kind of stuffy idiots who don't understand it. But then you get this picture, you go like, no, they're people who are rejoicing in the Savior of the world being in their presence. And you go, am I going to have to add to my list of apologies to the disciples in heaven for how I've talked about them?
Okay. Oh,
okay.
So this makes me think my perception of rabbis back then is that they would choose disciples or students, and that they would, like from John's disciples seem like they know what they're doing, they know what's going on, they know their job, and the people Jesus chooses isn't distinguished, smart, well-known. It's fishermen, and then there's like a tax collector who works for the Roman Empire, and what's the word for Simon, the zealot, who his deepest desire would be to overthrow the Roman Empire. And so he has just like very people who aren't educated and aren't or just wouldn't get along, and that I don't know, the comparison here that John's disciples often fast and pray, and Jesus' disciples walk up to Jesus and say, hey, how do we pray? And that he did that on purpose, and that he's not choosing the brightest of the bunch. But he is choosing very intentionally.
Yeah. Well, and that, I think it gets to the beautiful dynamic of like the new wineskin. The part of the old wineskin was thinking that those people weren't worthy of the presence of God, weren't worthy of having that direct link with him. And you have to wonder if part of that is where the Pharisees are coming from, or like you have to wonder if that's part of the heart. But like obviously John's disciples get this, but Jesus' disciples are such podunk idiots that they don't understand. And so like you wonder even if there's some bigotry there of like, how dare you try to take a step out of your place and into my place.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating that the whole just the self view. I would love to know if you're to freeze frame after they don't even ask a question, that's an assertion. So depending on the tone of voice, it could be an accusation. And basically the disciples, Jesus' disciples could have heard, your disciples are doing it so wrong. Not like, what is that about? Or do you have a good reason? It's just, they're just doing it wrong. And Jesus answered, and I just, in my mind's eye, I'm like, the apostles are like, yeah. And at the end, they're like, what did he say? Like, what are we right? Like, are we wrong? And there's no clear. I mean, you have this in the Sermon on the Mount. He's like, yeah, you see the Pharisees fasting; they're doing it wrong. But there's no clear instruction that I can remember Jesus ever giving to his apostles about, and I'm using the term apostles to distinguish from these other groups of disciples, but about how to fast or where fasting fits. Matter of fact, you might get the sense not to. Now, he does say here, in those days they will fast. But are you like, well, is that just during, the 3 days, after he's dead? Like, because he's living now, And so it's just fascinating, the lack of again, we keep coming to this, the lack of clarity.
Yeah.
When he has the opportunity to say, all right, guys, to be clear, here's when you fast, here's how you fast, here's what you do when you're fasting. There's no clear instruction on this.
Well, and you would think, you mentioned that before, and Jesus starts off part of his ministry by going and fasting for 40 days. And you go, if there was any guy who'd be like, listen, when I fasted, I had Satan himself try to tempt me away and, try to tempt me with every possible thing I did in the desert. Like, I know fasting. Like, if obviously, like, because he's God, like, we know that. But, like, the human side of him would be like, I've done this. Like, not only do I do it ritually, like, I've done this. Like, I've got this down pat. And so, obviously, Jesus respects fasting and honors fasting and thinks it's a valuable practice. And it's so interesting how easily it is for us to allow valuable practices to get in the way of connecting with God, and also how I can't think of the word, but we are often so precious with our practices, and Jesus isn't precious with fasting. Like, he's not like afraid he's going to break it. There's not a qualifier like at the end of this going to be like, now that being said, like, honestly, you should probably have a weekly fasting rhythm, and I would recommend X, Y, and Z, because Jesus isn't precious with these things. He's not worried about, like, I just moved recently, and me and my friends were talking about, like, when we moved, like, banging up the walls or whatever. Jesus isn't worried about moving the cabinet out of the dining room and banging up a wall. Like, he doesn't seem concerned about it like we are.
That might just be because he was a carpenter, but that's
might have had better understanding of angles and geometry. And...
Yeah, what fascinates me about this is it goes back to, why do we not have these things more clearly delineated? Here's how Jesus actually taught his apostles. We have this kind of osmosis that they're hanging around, they're watching. Unless they ask, they're not receiving other. He's not like, now what I meant by the old wineskin is that, you don't get this unless they ask for it. The other thing, baptism is clearly important. Like, before he fasted those 40 days, he's baptized. We never hear about when, Peter and Andrew, we don't know that they ever got baptized, because we're not told. No, we assume they are. We see that at one point during Jesus' ministry, they are baptizing, but it's fascinating. Why not? Why not tell us, he chose these 12 and said baptize, or early on he baptized them. And my point here isn't to root for or against baptism. It is that dynamic, though, of how unspecific he is with these things. The thing that jumps out at me, that it's just like, why would you even say that, is the perplexing piece, is that last verse, and no one after drinking old wine wants the new. And so he's like, he just makes the case that the new wine is, you got to get new wineskins, and that's perceived as the positive. I make the assumption that what he's saying here is this: it's hard to get used to the new wine. Your natural instinct is to cling to the old. And because literally old wine is superior to new wine, then that would make sense to their brains. But it seems funny not to then have another sentence, but you need to get used to the new wine, or you need to crave the new wine. It's just, okay.
But eventually wine goes rancid. He doesn't, like, why doesn't he? Yeah, it's weird that he doesn't do that.
Yeah, he concludes just this section, and again, like I said, after this, it's like, and on another Sabbath day when you have the chapter break. So it's like, okay. And then how does this end? They're all sitting there, and Jesus is like, yep, and the old is better. And the Pharisees are like, no, what happened? And the disciples are like, no, what happened? And Jesus is like, I gotta go. So it's like, all right.
Oh, man.
Oh, thank you for clearing that up, Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. So it's odd to me that he makes the case that the new is that superior, and the old, and he leaves it at this weird spot. And it was not necessary. To make his point, it's not necessary. Other than him saying, and I'm just making that up, is the idea of saying, look, I get it. Yeah. Is that his grace toward them? I get it. Yeah. I know you're more comfortable with the old, just like you're more comfortable with old wine than new. But I think he's making the case for, look, you keep trying to put these new things I'm teaching you into old constructs. It's going to bust.
So as we're wrapping up, Quincy, do you have any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I was actually a little anxious about coming on and talking, because I enjoyed the I enjoy listening to the podcast while I work, and I have known you guys for a while, and I just like have this desire to be eloquent and a desire to be like, perceived as smart or wise, and just like, yeah, I'm grateful that I have the opportunity to mess up and to. My fear is that now I'm going to go listen to the podcast and be like, oh, I'm so dumb. But just like, I love this opportunity to come and get to join you guys in this and get to participate in it.
Well, we appreciate it. I appreciate you joining us. And my hope, which one, I appreciate that you got to see our process and see how well oiled it was and no mistakes. But even at the beginning, this is an example of where Jason has taught me. Jason, when he was setting up the context, got it wrong and was like, oh yeah, I got it wrong, let's move forward or whatever. And
it's my gift.
And a lot of people, it'd be easy, obviously I'm going to cut a lot from this podcast because there's a lot of awkward pauses or whatever.
You're welcome.
It would be at least 50% of those are mine. It'd be really easy to be like, hey Connor, cut that for me, let's restart that again. But there's a lot of value in being okay with not getting things right. And I think that's why I enjoy this so much. Is very rarely do you start a podcast with like 2 minutes of being wrong and like, we're wrong, let's keep going. But there's actual value in the process of how you talked it out. And so that's where Jason has been so instructive to me and helpful for me. And so thank you. Yeah, thanks Quincy.
Thanks.
Jason.
Yeah, thank you, and really appreciate the support and your encouragement. To everybody in what is lovingly called the AIM world, that obviously that program had a huge impact on me, and I love to bless anybody in general, but specifically those students. I take a special. It's just encouraging. It's encouraging, and so I say that to say, don't ever doubt whether your encouragement matters. I mean, it is a big deal, very powerful in the hands of an incredibly loving and knowing God.
That was way too eloquent in the last little bit.
Knowing God. I practiced that for 7 hours.
You can tell. Thank you for listening. Grace, peace, and love.